Welcome to part 2 of our Scrappy Strippy half square triangle blocks. This is Joan Parker and I'm the Shelby Stitcher. I'm going to show you the construction of the blocks and also put some tips in here as I go along. I have a strip here of my backing fabric and I'm going to leave it on my sewing desk so that I can compare the fabrics to it. Here's a piece I had that I contemplated using, but obviously it almost matches this. So if this strip were sewn into a block, it would look like an L or a letter T. So I'm going to set that one aside for another use. What I'm going to show you right now is sewing on a foundation paper. This is an old piece of a phone book, and my strip of blue and my strip of paper are the same width, 3 3/4. The nice thing about sewing on paper, there's several good things about it. You can line up your strips with the print that's on the paper and know that it will be at a 90-degree angle. That's one good thing about it. The second thing is that it's free. Some people complain about having difficulty removing the paper, but if you make your stitch length shorter and fold it back before you tear it off, like you're ripping out a check out of a checkbook, it's very easy to do. I'll show you how to do that later. A couple more things about picking your strips out is you want to have a variety of colors. You can see I have light pink, a darkish paisley, a small scrap of a shirt, and all of these were donated to me. I didn't use everything that was donated to me, but you see there's a variety of widths in the strips as well. This one's 2 inches, this one's less than 1, and that gives you a chance to add in your odd shapes and sizes and widths without it standing out because there's so many different ones anyway. So I've turned my stitch length down to 1.8. The standard size on my machine is 2.4. I start in the middle of the strip, and all the strips in this little basket have been pre-cut to 4 inches long. My paper is 3 3/4, so I want to make sure that it extends out a little on both sides. Many times I'll reach back here and grab a pin or two just to keep this one in place. And that might be good if you're beginning, but do you see how I've had the fabric extend on both sides about 1/8 of an inch? Now I'm just taking the next strip, but if you find out you don't like that one, you can pick a different one. You put the right sides together, and again, eyeball how straight it is on your paper. You can see that little bit of purple sticking up. And I'm going to sew this. I'm sewing on a Janome 6700P as in Parker. So let's give this a whirl. And I normally would do 2 of these at a time so that I can use one as a leader and one as an ender. But what I'm going to do, instead of doing 2 paper ones in a row, is I'm going to actually do one without paper and one with. Now yesterday I was cleaning up my sewing table and I had a couple strips of shirts that were over 4 inches wide. So I cut them to 4 inches wide, and then I cut a variety of widths of strips out of all these. So I'm just going to set these outside of my box so that I can do a non-shirt and a shirt, and then another non-shirt and another non-shirt. I don't want all the shirts together, in other words. So I'm going to put them 3 or 4 pieces apart. Now these are the same length, so I'm going to line up the seam on there. And I don't need to use the shorter stitch length, but I'm going to just leave it there so that I don't keep going back and forth. And I keep these little snips on a magnetic suction cup on top of my sewing machine, and I always just have a habit of setting them back up there. Now normally I would press this open with an iron, but I don't have my iron turned on. My iron is located right under where my camera is set up on the tripod right now. So I just open this up with my finger and I just finger press that open. And because the paper doesn't shift like fabric does alone, it's easy to finger press that. Now my next fabric is in the box is the same one. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to one from the other stack. As you can see, I have 2 stacks in here. Sometimes I'll divide it up into 3 if I get too much that are the same stacked up. And again, I'm going to be just lining this up so that it goes over just a little bit on both sides and stitch this on the 1.8 stitch length selector. The other nice part of using paper, there are several advantages to it, but I understand that it's not everybody's cup of tea. One is that you can see what width you're shooting for. In other words, if your pieces are not 3 3/4 inches wide, you're going to have a space there in your stitching. And if it's just a very tiny 1/16 of an inch or so, that's not a problem. But if you find that they're all less then your seam allowance, you're going to have holes, and it's very frustrating to have to keep taking those short pieces out and replacing them with longer ones. So that's the advantage to sewing on paper. Now I'm just sewing 2 strips of fabric to each other. And to be honest, when I first started sewing this, I was doing them all on paper foundations because that's what I'm used to doing. Then I realized that I was able, because I'm a very meticulous piecer, I was able to not use paper and just be careful about how I laid my pieces together without it. And now you can see on this strip was a little wider here. Here's my line of reference, and it's closer here than it is over here. So I can either lay this one parallel to the printed line like I'm going to do, or I could line it up with the fabric and start a little bit of wonkiness going on. And that's fine if you don't mind that. And to be honest, I usually don't mind if one's a little bit off, but you need to make sure it's going to be long enough to be within your seam allowance when you trim it down. Now the last strip I used on that paper one and the last one on this are the same print, but these are not going to be right beside each other in the strip. So again, I finger press that one, and you can see how carefully I'm lining up the seam allowances over here. And here's another paisley. I'll just chat a little bit about how I selected my fabrics as I sew these. I'll try to sew quietly so you can still hear me. But like I told you in the earlier video, most of these fabrics were donated to me. Just a handful of the shirts were ones I already had on my sewing desk. And what I did is I was going through them when I initially got them, was I was immediately setting aside any that I knew I would not be using ever. I didn't want to touch a fabric more than one time. I wanted to just get it out of my stash, out of even the possibility of getting into my stash if I could. So I took the time to call them right then and there. Now I had a box that I was donating, and I had a box I was discarding. Sometimes when a person has old fabrics that they've recovered from somebody's home that's passed away, or somebody that hasn't quilted in many years, different pests get into the fabric, and there are little hole marks from chewing, or there are droppings from mice or whatever. I just get rid of those immediately because they're not going to be good for anybody. If there's any chance that anybody could use it, however, I do set it aside in a separate pile. Alright, I'm here. I am just sewing the fabric together without any paper foundation. And I think I'm going to stop after this one to show you how I put this with this strip of fabric. Well, I will need to run over a leader ender here so that I can get this out from under the sewing machine. I'm going to just finger press this, and we'll just call that a day. So here's the strip I've made so far. I'm going to take this over to my cutting table and make sure it is 3 3/4 inches wide. I'm back. Welcoming myself back. Here's how much I trimmed off that strip. As you remember, they were only 1/4 inch wide total, more than what I already had cut. So here's a piece I just made, and here is the end of the block I cut my last triangle off of to make a block. So I just look at these and make sure that this fabric isn't anywhere real close to here. Now these two are exactly the same, these orange ones and these purple ones, but they're going to be in 2 different triangles, so that won't matter. So I'm just going to line these up, and I made sure they were square with the strip of fabric. And I'm going to sew these two together to extend my colored strips that I'll be sewing to the blue. Let me get my leader ender again. I always have one of these near my machine. It's just a piece of scrap. Actually, usually I'm actually sewing another quilt, but I don't have any pieces in front of me right now. So I'm going to open this up, and again, I would iron this if my iron were turned on, but it's right under my camera. And I'm just going to finger press that. And you see on the back that these go both directions, up and down, the seam allowances. So you want to be careful when you're sewing to not get them flipped the wrong way. Here is the end of where I cut off my last triangle block. You can see that 45-degree angle. So I'm going to put these together now, and I'm going to sew after I get them matched. I'm going to sew down both sides of the strip 1/4 inch from each side. I'm going to do just a little bit of that right now so I can show you how to cut at least one block. But see, they match perfectly, and I'm going to sew this with a normal seam allowance, not the shorter one, because there's no paper involved. And I just lift it up occasionally and make sure I'm not pushing that seam allowance the wrong way. If you feel like you need to, you can pin it, but you can feel if it's flipped as it's going over that little ramp on the silver part of your sewing machine plate right there. So I'm just going to go a little bit further. I'm going to stop here. And what you're doing is making a tube of fabric. And I'm just going to turn this around. I'm going to take my leader ender off of where I started and place that over on my machine. And now I only sewed up to here on my strip set. So I'm going to go straight across from that and line that up with the 1/4 inch mark. Oh, and one more tip. As I was going through the box in which this blue fabric was when I first received it, I just assumed that all of the blue strips were the same width. And I found out that some of them were just a shade like thinner or wider because the person that was sewing with them was sewing before the days of rotary cutters, and she hand cut all the strips. So now I am checking every time to make sure that they truly are 3 3/4, and I've just shaved off a little bit here and there. Now we're going to go over to my cutting table, and I'm going to show you how to cut this, and we're going to press it. Here we are with this strip set over at my cutting table, and I'm going to move my rulers out of the way. I bought a couple of these pop something, I forget what the word is. They're to put on the back of your phone, but they make it really easy to grab onto your ruler, not while you're cutting, but just to pick it up. Sometimes my ruler's down on my cutting mat, and it's very hard for me to pick up. Okay, so again, I don't know if you can see this in the video, but I stopped sewing here, and then on the bottom I sewed to about the same length. The ruler I'm using to cut this out is this Companion Angle by Easy Quilting, and in a way it doesn't really matter how wide your strip is. You just line that little notch on the top up with the top of your colored strip. Mine's blue, so on the blue strip, and then you make sure that this is lined up perfectly with the edge of your fabric. If it isn't, you can just adjust your fabric a little bit. Now we just go ahead and press here, and that's one block finished. And if I had sewn further on this strip, I would just flip this over and I would keep cutting out the next strip. And if I notice that one of my seam allowances is flipped the wrong direction, what I'll do is put a little safety pin in there so that when I go over to press it, I can take out a couple of those stitches and flip it the right direction, because that's just how I am. I'm going to move that out of the way, and I'm going to show you that there are just 4 or 5 stitches up here at the skinny edge of our triangle, and this seam of course runs the whole way along, but at the top there's just a few stitches there. If you've got a tiny piece of thread there, you can just pull on it and pull it out like I just did. And then we are going to take this to the iron, and we're going to iron this open like this. Let me go do that, and I'll be right back.